In the darkest hour of human history, when bombs rained from the sky and hope nearly vanished, one man stood like a lion. His voice became Britain's sword. His courage lit the path for a broken world. This is the story of Winston Churchill, the man who said, "We shall never surrender." Born into a world of privilege, raised in hardship, and tested by war, Winston Churchill would become more than a leader. He became a symbol of resistance, of hope, and of fierce determination. The world did not expect greatness from Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. If you're someone who feels a chill down your spine when history whispers its forgotten tales, if you find beauty in broken crowns, lost empires, and powerful souls who changed the world, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Dark Historian Tales, the channel where we bring the shadows of the past into the light. Through emotional storytelling, raw truths, and dramatic journeys that shaped humanity. This isn't just history, it's the heartbeat of those who lived, loved, lost, and left a legacy. Backhand Index Pointing writes, so if you love powerful historical stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. Because here, history doesn't just speak, it haunts. Born on November 30th, 1874, inside the opulent walls of Blenheim Palace, he entered the world not as a hero, but as a frail, sickly child in a cold, aristocratic home. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant but volatile politician. His mother, Jenny Jerome, a dazzling American socialite, dazzled society, but rarely embraced her son. Winston's early life was marked not by love, but by neglect. He was raised by a nanny he adored, Miss Elizabeth Everest, whom he called Wom. She gave him warmth his parents rarely did. When he cried, she listened. When he fell ill, she stayed up all night. In a letter years later, Churchill wrote, "She was my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived." But beneath the soft light of childhood affection, shadows gathered. He was sent to boarding school at just 7 years old, where the iron rules and harsh punishments broke many boys. They nearly broke Winston too. He was often bullied. He stuttered. He lisped. Teachers called him lazy. He ranked low in his class. His father believed he would amount to nothing, calling him a wastrel in private letters. Imagine being a child, desperate to make his father proud, only to be dismissed as a disappointment, again and again. And yet, even in those cold school halls, something flickered. A fire. Winston didn't shine in math or Latin, but he devoured books about battles, generals, kings, and warriors. He loved history, war strategy, and stories of unbreakable courage. He began to imagine his life not as a failure, but as a fight waiting to be won. When it came time to enter the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, he failed the entrance exam. Twice. The world might have laughed and moved on, but Winston didn't quit. On the third try, he passed. His dream was not to rule, but to fight. He joined the British Army and was soon sent to far-off lands, India, Sudan, Cuba, South Africa, not just as a soldier, but as a writer and war correspondent. He rode into real battles with real bullets. He didn't hide in the safety of his name or his connections. He chased danger with wide eyes and a beating heart. In one famous moment during the Boer War, Churchill was captured and taken as a prisoner of war. It would have been the end for most men. But Churchill made a bold escape, scaling a wall, sneaking through enemy territory, and traveling hundreds of miles to freedom. He returned home to Britain not as a footnote, but a rising star. He was only 25, and now the boy once called a disappointment became a member of Parliament. With a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, he entered politics like a whirlwind, speaking fearlessly, challenging the old guard, and rising through the ranks. But his confidence would become both his weapon and his curse. Churchill switched parties, from conservative to liberal, angering his allies. He clashed with generals. He made enemies. His mouth was a sword, but sometimes it cut too deep. And in 1915, it nearly destroyed him. As First Lord of the Admiralty during World War I, Churchill masterminded the Gallipoli campaign, a bold naval attack meant to strike a blow to the Ottoman Empire. But it failed disastrously. Thousands of soldiers died. The public was furious. Churchill was forced to resign. His political career was in ruins. This was a man who had tasted greatness, only to choke on it. He was 41 years old and finished, or so they said. But instead of hiding, Churchill returned to the front lines, not as a politician, but as a soldier once again. He fought in the trenches of the Western Front during World War I, shoulder to shoulder with ordinary men. He risked his life to prove that he had not lost his courage, even if he had lost his post. When the war ended, Churchill clawed his way back into politics, but the shadows returned. In the 1930s, the world danced dangerously with fascism. Adolf Hitler was rising in Germany. Italy fell to Mussolini. The League of Nations was failing, and Churchill was ignored. He warned Parliament. He gave speeches. He begged Britain to rearm, to prepare, to see what was coming. But the world didn't want war. It wanted peace at any cost. So they laughed at Churchill, called him a relic, said he was obsessed with war, mocked him in the newspapers. Even his own party cast him aside. These were Churchill's wilderness years, almost a decade in political exile. He lived with rejection. He watched Hitler grow stronger. He sat in silence while Europe drifted toward disaster. But he never gave up. He read, wrote, and studied. He gave small speeches in dimly lit rooms. He continued warning the world that peace bought with fear is not peace. It is delay. It is surrender dressed as hope. And then came 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. The world could no longer pretend. Churchill was brought back to government, first as First Lord of the Admiralty again, and then on May 10, 1940, as Europe burned, Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister, and Winston Churchill, the man once cast aside, became Britain's leader. It had taken him a lifetime. He had failed, been ridiculed, rejected. He had been broken again and again, but still he rose. Because Winston Churchill understood something few ever do, that courage is not the absence of failure, it is the refusal to be defined by it. In the opening hours of his premiership, he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." And the world, broken, fearful, uncertain, listened. The unlikely warrior had returned, not as a perfect man, not as a saint, but as a survivor, a fighter, a leader forged not in privilege, but in pain. To each, there comes in their lifetime a moment where they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered a chance to do something truly great. What a tragedy it would be to not be ready. For Winston Churchill, that tap on the shoulder came on the bleak and thunderous morning of May 10th, 1940. The storm that had been brewing for over a decade had finally unleashed itself. Adolf Hitler's war machine rolled into Belgium and the Netherlands, crushing everything in its path with ruthless precision. France was gasping for air. The British government, shaken and broken, was bleeding from within. Neville Chamberlain, the man who had tried to soothe the dragon with promises of peace, had failed. His policy of appeasement had bought time, but at a terrible cost. Britain was now alone, cornered, and staring into the jaws of the most dangerous tyrant the world had ever seen. And in that chaos, Winston Churchill was summoned to lead. He was 65, tired, scorned by many, haunted by the ghosts of Gallipoli. Some still whispered he was unstable, a warmonger, a relic of a past era. But in the corridors of Downing Street, Churchill walked with the weight of history on his shoulders and a fire in his chest. He took the oath of office. He did not smile, because there was no time to smile. Within days of Churchill taking power, the unimaginable happened. France collapsed. Hitler's blitzkrieg tore through the French countryside with brutal efficiency. The French army, once thought to be the most powerful in Europe, crumbled. Paris was soon within reach of Nazi forces. The British Expeditionary Force, over 300,000 soldiers, was stranded at Dunkirk, surrounded by enemy tanks and facing certain death. Churchill was told to prepare for catastrophic losses. But Churchill refused to surrender to despair. In one of the most daring and desperate evacuations in history, he launched Operation Dynamo, calling on every ship, fishing boat, and civilian vessel across the English Channel. "We shall fight on the beaches." The speech echoed through Britain like a drum of defiance. Thousands of ordinary Britons answered the call. In a miraculous turn, over 330,000 troops were rescued. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance, but he did not let the people forget. Wars are not won by evacuations. Now, the unthinkable loomed over Britain. With France gone, Hitler turned his eyes to the British Isles. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of England, was underway. Never in modern history had Britain faced such isolation. Her allies had fallen. Her empire was far. And across the Channel, Nazi forces waited like wolves in the dark. Every morning, Churchill woke to reports of death. Bombs over Rotterdam, cities burning, armies surrendering. And yet, his voice remained unshaken. He met daily with the War Cabinet, a volatile mix of political enemies, skeptics, and doubters. Some wanted to sue for peace. Hitler, through Italian dictator Mussolini, offered terms. Some believed Churchill should take them. But Churchill, with eyes like steel, thundered. "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." He refused negotiations, refused surrender, refused anything but victory. Then came July 1940. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, launched the Battle of Britain, aiming to wipe out the Royal Air Force and pave the way for invasion. Day after day, British pilots, some still in their teens, took to the skies in Spitfires and Hurricanes, vastly outnumbered. They flew with death in their mirrors, fighting wave after wave of enemy fighters. Churchill watched from the command centers, often breaking down in tears after battle updates. One evening, after a particularly vicious air raid, he looked upon the scorched earth of a bombed-out neighborhood and said, "These are not dark days. These are great days, the greatest days our country has ever lived. And we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our stations, to play a part in them." In September 1940, the Luftwaffe began the Blitz, strategic bombing raids meant to break British morale. London was hit 57 nights in a row. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, and countless others were turned to ash. Children died in their sleep. Mothers cried in rubble. Fires raged in the streets. Still, Churchill stood. Every time a bomb fell, he walked the ruins. He refused to flee to the countryside or shelter underground. He stood with the people, spoke to them, held their hands. His presence became the symbol of British defiance. Let them do their worst. We shall do our best. Churchill's leadership was not without cost. He barely slept, drank heavily, lost weight, ached in silence. He wrote letters to families of fallen soldiers with trembling hands. He fought not just Hitler, but bureaucracy, critics, and even his own party. But he never faltered in front of his people. To them, he was not a man. He was a voice, a flame, a lion, and in the skies above, the RAF held the line. Hitler's Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. Britain had survived the invasion. Churchill praised the young airmen who made it possible. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Still, Churchill knew Britain could not win this war alone. He needed the United States. But in 1940, America was not ready. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a divided Congress and a public weary of war. So Churchill turned to the only weapon he had left: words. He wrote letters to Roosevelt, dozens. He made speeches that crossed the Atlantic by radio. He painted pictures of a world falling to fascism, of mothers in London crying under fire, of a future ruled by darkness. In March 1941, his efforts bore fruit. The U.S. passed the Lend-Lease Act, sending vital aid, arms, and support to Britain. And Churchill, hearing the news, wept privately. It was hope, not a promise of victory, but a torch in the dark. Underscore, 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 underscore. By late 1941, Churchill had kept Britain alive for nearly 2 years. But the ultimate shift came on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. Churchill, upon hearing the news, said, "So, we had won after all. Yes, after Dunkirk, after the fall of France, after the threat of invasion, we now had won the war. England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations, and the Empire would live." He traveled to the United States, addressed Congress, and reminded the world, what kind of people do they think we are? His speech was thunderous, his message clear. The fight was far from over, but now they would not fight alone. The months that followed were still full of death and struggle, but a shift had begun. The Allies were forming. The tides were turning. Churchill had guided his nation through the very edge of destruction, fueled by nothing but his words, his will, and his unwavering belief in freedom. When asked later how he endured those early days, he answered simply, "I was not the lion, but it fell to me to give the lion's roar." It was a cold morning in early 1942. London still smoked from months of firebombs. Graves were still being dug. Children still awoke from nightmares born of sirens. But something had changed. The skies above Britain were clearer. Across the Atlantic, the American eagle had taken flight, its wings spread over a war it could no longer ignore. For the first time in years, Churchill stood not as the last man standing, but as one among giants rising. The Allies, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, had formed a reluctant yet desperate bond. But the road to victory was long and brutal, and Churchill knew this New World alliance would test everything he believed in: friendship, strategy, and even morality. The deserts of North Africa became the proving ground. Under the unforgiving sun, British and American forces launched a counteroffensive against Hitler's Afrika Korps, commanded by the infamous General Rommel, the Desert Fox. Churchill placed his faith in a new general, Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery, precise and methodical, led the charge at El Alamein, a critical turning point. In October 1942, the Allies finally shattered Rommel's advance. Churchill's words roared again. "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was more than a military win. It was psychological salvation. Britain could believe again. Churchill now stood shoulder to shoulder with two of history's most consequential figures, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin. Together, they formed the uneasy triangle known as the Big Three. Roosevelt, calm, cunning, and eloquent. Stalin, ruthless, cold-eyed, demanding. Churchill, bold, emotional, unpredictable. Together, they debated over maps and spilled ink across treaties. But Churchill's burden was heavier than most. He was not the leader of a superpower. Britain was exhausted, its colonies strained, its economy bleeding. But Churchill, with all his diplomatic fire, ensured Britain remained at the table, not under it. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily, then advanced up Italy, forcing Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, out of power. Churchill had always believed in attacking the soft underbelly of Europe rather than storming France immediately. Italy proved him right, but victory came at a cost. The campaign was slow, muddy, and merciless. Mountains became killing fields. Progress came inch by inch. Churchill visited wounded soldiers and walked the ruined towns. In letters, he mourned the glorious dead while begging generals to move faster, strike harder, and bring an end to the madness. The war was shifting, but time was running out for soldiers, for civilians, for Churchill himself. Meanwhile, Stalin demanded a second front in the West to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, which had already lost millions fighting Hitler. Churchill sympathized, but knew an early invasion of France would be suicide. The tension nearly tore the alliance apart. Churchill walked a tightrope, supporting Stalin without surrendering strategy, encouraging Roosevelt without being sidelined. He made multiple trips to Moscow, sometimes flying for 16 hours straight in unpressurized planes, battling altitude sickness and fatigue just to look Stalin in the eyes. You ask me, what is our policy? To wage war with all our might until the monstrous tyranny has been finally overthrown. That was Churchill's creed. And finally, after 2 years of planning, deception, and delay, it was time. Nothing would prepare the world for the morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day. In the largest amphibious invasion in history, over 156,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel and stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. Churchill had waited years for this moment. He wanted to join the soldiers, to be aboard a ship in the first wave. His advisors begged him not to. The king himself forbade it. Churchill, reluctantly, obeyed. But his soul was on those beaches. Bullets rained. Men screamed. The sea turned red. But they pressed on. By nightfall, the beaches were secured. The light of liberation has come. Europe breathes again. France was retaken. Paris freed. The Nazi war machine was breaking. By April 1945, Allied forces had pushed into Germany from both east and west. Cities lay in ruins. Death camps were discovered. The full horror of the Holocaust stunned the world. Churchill's eyes welled as he read the reports. Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. 6 million Jews murdered. He had warned the world about the darkness, but even he hadn't imagined its full extent. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. And on May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day V-Day, Churchill addressed the nation. "This is your victory." The crowd roared. Then he added softly, "In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this." The lion had led his pride to safety. But history, with its cruel irony, was not yet done with Churchill. Just 2 months after V-Day, as the war in the Pacific still raged, Britain held a general election. To nearly everyone's shock, including his own, Churchill lost. The man who had saved Britain was no longer wanted. Exhausted voters turned to the Labour Party, promising housing, jobs, and peace. Churchill's face darkened. He did not protest. He did not lash out. He packed his belongings, walked out of 10 Downing Street. He had won the war, but lost his people. Churchill did not vanish. He returned as Prime Minister once more in 1951, though age and illness had taken their toll. He delivered the famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, warning of Soviet aggression. Once again, he foresaw the next storm. But time marched on. In 1955, he resigned permanently. He spent his final years painting, writing, and watching a world he had shaped move into the atomic age. On January 24, 1965, Winston Churchill died at the age of 90. The world mourned. He was given a state funeral, the first for a commoner since the Duke of Wellington. Leaders from across the globe came to say goodbye. His coffin floated down the Thames as cranes along the river dipped in salute. The lion had fallen silent. Churchill was never perfect. He was stubborn, flawed, sometimes wrong. But when the world needed courage, vision, and voice, he gave all he had. Not for glory, not for power, but because he believed fiercely and completely in freedom. And when history remembers the darkest chapters of the 20th century, it does not whisper his name. It roars it. In the end, Winston Churchill didn't live for applause. He didn't lead for votes, or titles, or statues. He led because when the world was at the edge of the abyss, when bombs fell, and empires crumbled, and hope flickered like a dying flame, he stood alone, lit the torch, and walked straight into the storm. He carried a nation in his voice. He defied tyranny with nothing but words and willpower. And he proved, perhaps better than anyone, that one voice, one soul, can change the course of history. He lost battles. He lost elections. He lost friends and years of his life. But he never lost his courage. In a quiet corner of Blaydon, Oxfordshire, he lies buried, not beneath a throne, but in the dirt of the country he loved. Visitors leave small stones beside his grave. They whisper thanks, because deep down they know, without him, the night might have lasted forever. So, when you hear thunder in the distance, when the world grows dark, and you feel small in the face of it all, remember Winston Churchill, not because he was perfect, but because he refused to be broken. Fear is a reaction. Courage is a decision. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of what it means to stand tall when everything around you is falling, backhand index pointing right, then don't let it end here. Fire like this video if you believe the world still needs courage. Bellhop Bell, subscribe for more powerful stories of the people who changed history. Speech balloon, and in the comments below, tell us, what would you do if the world turned to you in its darkest hour? Because maybe one day, it won't be Churchill's story we tell. Maybe it'll be yours. Kites rise highest against the wind. Not with it. Winston Churchill.